Good evening and welcome to Prairie Lights. Tonight we are delighted to welcome Writers Workshop graduate Julia Fierro back to Iowa City and to Prairie Lights in particular to read from her new book, Cutting Teeth. Deb Kogan says, "Funny, warm, and dead-on smart, Cutting Teeth reads like a conversation with your best friend over wine after the kids have been tucked in and the truth comes out." Karen Thompson Walker, author of The Age of Miracles, says, "Timely and observant, Julia Fierro's debut feels like real life. She captures the anxiety of our times with the authority, insight, and humor of lived experience." Cutting Teeth was included on the most anticipated books of 2014 lists by HuffPost Books, The Millions, Flavor Wire, Brooklyn Magazine, and Marie Claire. Fierro's work has been published or is forthcoming in Guernica, Plowshares, Poets and Writers, and other publications, and she's been profiled in the Elle Magazine, Brooklyn Magazine, The Observer, and The Economist. In 2002, Julia founded the Sackett Street Writers Workshop, and what started as 8 writers meeting in her Carroll Gardens kitchen, that's in Brooklyn, has grown into a creative home for over 2,000 writers. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which I mentioned, where she was a teaching writing fellow. She has been an instructor at the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, and she currently teaches the post-MFA workshops at Sackett Street. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 small children. I'm very happy to have her here in Iowa City tonight. Please welcome Julia Fierro.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. This is so many people. Thank you. I'm sure you've heard a lot of returning writers, workshop writers say things like, "It means so much to me to be here." But it really does. And as I'm really happy to also see some of my former students from the writing festival and old friends here. And Iowa City was the first place that I felt comfortable with myself, really, because I grew up in a home where, I was definitely told many times to stop thinking so much, to relax, and it wasn't a home that had a lot of books. And my father's Italian, and so we did have some Italian encyclopedias, and I used to steal my grandmother's romance novels, but we didn't have that many books, and so, the library was a very special place for me. And when I was 9 years old, we moved into a new house, and that basement was filled with books that the people who left had left behind. And, I wasn't yet old enough to appreciate those books because they were kind of racy. There were a lot of paperbacks, like romance, thrillers. And when I was probably about 11 or 12, I finally made it down into the basement. And there were like 1,000 paperbacks down there. And so that's where I read like Psycho and like all of Stephen King and Clan of the Cave Bear, so I think that was when I really, really became a reader, very interested in storytelling. And in college, I didn't know any writers. And so when I was accepted at Iowa, after calling to make sure that they didn't make a mistake, did anyone else do that? Anybody else? All right, there. They were like, no, a lot of people call and ask that. I remember coming here to find a apartment with my then boyfriend, who's now my husband of 12 years. And I came into Prairie Lights, and I can't remember exactly where the bookshelf was, but it was a shelf of books about the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I was like, wait a second. I called my husband over, and I was like, this place is really, I think we should leave, and so I bought like all of them, I still have them. And it was the first place where I felt like I was around people who thought and felt the way that I did, that life was full of meaning, that every detail in life, every single one, is full of meaning. And so all those years I'd spent feeling very alone, thinking that there was something wrong with my way of thinking and my way of analyzing and interpreting the world, sort of, melted away, and I felt very safe until I went to workshop. And then I was like, whoa, these people are intense. But, it really was an incredible feeling. And also, I've said this a lot on panels and, when I give talks about writing and my life as a writer. Iowa gave me the permission to take myself seriously as a writer with a capital W. And I don't think that I'm pretty sure, actually, that I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been accepted at Iowa, because I was able to sort of, it was really a lot of work to sort of, give myself that permission to think of myself as a writer, and also, believe that writing is something that you could do and actually, maybe make a little tiny bit of money doing. But really it was my love of craft that I was able to, I've been over analytical, obsessive compulsive my whole young life, and I was able to apply it to the craft of fiction writing in a way that was really meaningful and helpful. And so it was at Iowa where I learned the basics of fiction writing. I know we're supposed to already know that stuff when we get here, so don't tell that many people to know this is being recorded. But, so I really learned so much. And also to be in a community like Iowa City, where writing and writers is treated with such, with such respect, is incredible. And Prairie Lights is just it's such a monumental place in so many writers and readers' lives. And I think it's easy for us to forget that there's so many towns and cities that don't have independent bookstores, and it's really up to us to support them. And so that's why you should buy my book. And I spent so many hours here, really. It was very, really important. And so I have a couple of notes here that I want to say. And I actually remember, so this was also the first place that I went to readings. And that was so exciting. I mean, I remember like sitting there and like feeling, like my heart was vibrating while I listened to writers talk about their process. And there were two moments that I remember specifically. Oh no, three. The first was Mona Simpson breastfeeding her baby while she was giving a reading, which was awesome. I was like, oh my God. And I really admired her. And I have done that when I'm interviewing potential instructors, but never when I was reading in front of an audience. And the next was when Jonathan Franzen was making fun of the Oprah sticker on his book for the corrections. And we were all looking around at each other like, he's going to get in so much trouble. And the third time was when Charles Baxter was talking about writing The Feast of Love, which we were reading in Sam Chang's novel seminar. and he talked about, he's just so charismatic, and also there's a lot of great sex writing in that book if you're looking for a good example. He's really good at writing about it. And he taught, hopefully, I don't think he's here, but, and he was talking about how his character, he hadn't really figured out why, what was at stake for the two of the younger characters who are in love in the book. And he realized, he talked about how he realized that this one character, was ill. In this moment, this really beautiful, intimate moment where the young girl has her ear pressed against her lover's chest. And it was so magical to see a writer that I admired so much talk about that miracle of revelation that happens in novel writing. And I've carried it with me for so many years, and in all the novel writing workshops that I've taught, I've thought about that moment. And so I'm really happy to be here, very happy to be in Iowa City, where, as I told the students at the workshop today, I got in a cab. Well, first of all, I got off the megabus and I was all frustrated because there weren't like cabs driving around. I'm a real New Yorker now. And then the cab driver came and he asked me why I was there, and I said, I'm here. I'm here to read a Prairie Lights. It's like I've been waiting for this moment for 12 years that I can tell somebody in Iowa City. And he was like, what genre? And I was like, wow. And then he asked me, he said, it was just, we were in the car together for about 7 minutes, not even. And he goes, what do you think is the difference between magical realism and sci-fi? And I was like, I don't know. I've never really thought about that. Even though I have thought about it, but yes, but not in that way. And then he started talking for a very long time and kind of, was talked about it for about 20 minutes, and he had a lot of ideas, and I was just thinking that, like, what an amazing moment that was, and only in Iowa City. And so, just to tell you a little bit about cutting teeth, as I told the writers at the workshop today, I graduated from Iowa. My first book did not get published, right? Even though Sam today told me, she's like, that book was not that bad. And it was devastating, and I stopped writing for a very long time, and I tried to recreate that feeling that I had here at Iowa in Brooklyn by starting the Sackett Street Writers Workshop. And in the last 12 years, there's been a lot of Sackett Street Writers, more than 2,500. And it wasn't until my second child was born that she turned 2, actually, and I was able to make enough money through Sackett Street to double my babysitting hours, and join the writer space that was open 24 hours, 7 days a week, which was amazing. So I would stay there until like midnight, running up and down the cubicle aisles. It was very exciting. And I wrote Cutting Teeth in less than 9 months because I had a limited amount of babysitting money, and it was really an amazing experience. I had very much given up hope and faith in myself as a writer, and the book is about. Book has been said it's about a lot of things. A lot of people like to call it a satire, and it would be really easy. It would be much easier for me to say yes, it is. But I didn't write it that way. Like, I really did write it in a very honest, sort of, probably slightly obsessive compulsive perspective. And I really wrote it, I write to inform myself, like we all do, of how I feel about life, about myself, about my place in the world. And I think it's the same thing that we all looked to books for when we were readers, when we were early readers. And so I was investigating how I felt about being a woman in this time, in this place, which I feel very privileged to be a woman right now, because my mother and my grandmothers had a very different experience, particularly with motherhood. And I really wanted to sort of also investigate female friendships. And some of them are a little dark in the book. And so it's about a group of 30-ish something couples, even though it's in Brooklyn. So you would probably have to say that they're early 40-ish something couples with young children. And they go away for a weekend together, a 3-day weekend. And I realized now that I was giving myself this fun point of view exercise. I love working very closely to characters' consciousness, so I picked 7 perspectives, which is a lot, and I wouldn't recommend that. And maybe 5 would be good. And just stuffed them in this somewhat shabby beach house for a 3-day weekend, and hoped to show how they're different, how differently each character interprets the same events, based on their needs and their fears and the secrets that they're trying very hard to keep from even those who they're closest to. So, sorry, I'm a little more nervous. I've only done like 300 readings in the last 4 months, but it's Prairie Lights. You guys are Iowans. Respect you more than all the other Americans. Okay. So I'm going to read from the opening chapter, which is from Nicole's perspective, and it's called Red Alert. The playground was half empty, as it is most late summer Thursdays in the Brooklyn neighborhoods where the young professionals live. Those who summer, who go in with 1 or 2 couples and rent a cottage on Fire Island or out east. Those who eat organic and buy green and practice hot yoga and are in treatment, and who name their children without a second thought after Greek goddesses and dead poets. Nicole pushed her almost 4-year-old son Wyatt on the swings, his cries of more, more, more fading, then rising as he swayed back and forth. Dusk was settling, the smoky veil that had hinted at danger for as long as Nicole could remember, the gloaming. The word still made her think of restless spirits and mistrustful things, the ghoulish witches in the dark woods of her childhood. The sun ricocheted off the sunglasses of the mother standing next to her, the spinning spokes of the tricycles, the side doors of the cars squeezed up and down the block, and Nicole shielded her eyes with her hand. The fumes from the ice cream truck idling on the corner scratched at her throat. The little girl in the next swing coughed, and Nicole steeled herself. The child had a wet, phlegmy cough, after all, not a dry, raspy cough, which is what the Centers for Disease Control had listed as symptoms, warning signs. Relax, Nicole thought, it's just a summer cold. Honey, the girl's mother said, how do we cough? The little girl lifted her arm to her face and coughed in the direction of her elbow, all the while looking up at her mother, seeking her approval. The mother smiled at Nicole with an apologetic shrug, and Nicole knew she was expected to commiserate. She shook her head knowingly and pointed to Wyatt, still clad in his white karate uniform. I tell this guy the same thing every day. The woman smiled, relieved. They make you so paranoid, all those hand-washing ads. Nicole tried to swing Wyatt away from the little girl, who continued to cough. A cough so productive Nicole thought she could see the minuscule drops of saliva flying toward Wyatt's gaping mouth. Okay, she said with a big exhale between syllables. We have to go now. She gripped the chain of the swing and stopped him to abruptly. Wyatt nearly flew out of his seat. I'm sorry, sweetie, she laughed. Mommy's so silly. I don't want to go. I want to stay. His lower lip displayed a clownish quiver. I'm sorry, I really am, but we have to go, mister. Nicole was sorry. Sorry she was ruining his afternoon and, perhaps she thought with a growing panic, ruining his life by visiting the park because she was certain the little girl was very ill. Certain that within a few hours the girl would be shivering with fever in bed, a nasal swab sample on its way to the hospital lab. Because isn't that what they said online on the news and in the handouts that had been given out at Wyatt's preschool? That it hit fast and hard. That you woke with a sore throat in the morning and by nightfall had a high fever. At first, Nicole had tried to avoid the news. She had even considered, at her husband Josh's prodding, disabling the wireless, shutting off the cable, but reminders were practically everywhere. In CNN's top headlines and most popular online searches. The public service commercials with that ridiculous rhyme, know what to do about the flu. She had Googled flu and swine flu and H1N1 so many times that the little ads that popped up in the margins of her email were all for antibacterial hand soaps and flu remedies. Wyatt's hands, white-knuckled, gripped the swing's chains. Nicole leaned over him and whispered, her lips close to his flushed cheek, "You want a treat?" She tucked her fingers into the sweat-damp curls at the back of his neck, sweet little boy sweat that smelled of apple juice and cut grass. She inhaled, wishing she could stop time and bottle the smell, bottle Wyatt even, because one day it would all be over. Wyatt would be a harsh-smelling, hard-angled man. She and Josh would be old, dead. A plane passed overhead, a whoosh that built and built until it seemed to Nicole that a great big hand had unzipped the sky, and she looked around to see if anyone else had heard it, had felt it as a warning of some kind. There were a few mothers looking up, shielding their eyes with freshly manicured hands. Was it too low, Nicole wanted to ask? Did they think it was suspicious? The engines were awfully loud, weren't they? She snapped the rubber band on her wrist, an assignment from her therapist, pulling it farther away each time, the sting growing with each release. Nothing bad is happening. She looked again at the sky to watch, to wait for the sign that all was clear, that it was just her ever-faulty interpretation she had, even as a child, doubted. She was about to turn to the sick child's mother to ask, "Did you feel that?" when something changed. What exactly, she couldn't say, but it was there, an offness that reminded her of the light right before an eclipse, an otherworldly light, and she kept asking herself, what is it? What is it? She lunged for the chains of Wyatt's swing, jerking him up and out so fast his foot caught in the seat, and he fell to the ground, his plump fingers splayed in the dirt. This is it. This is it. The panic buzzed in her chest, and there was a sudden adjustment in her vision, like she could see through goddamned walls. It was only the pink chemical blush of the overhead street lamps coming on. A child behind her yelled, "Pretty lights," and Nicole heard comfort in the little girl's voice. She, too, wanted to be fearless. She pressed Wyatt's face to her chest, hiding that silent, open-mouthed wail, the precursor to great gulping cries. She shushed him, whispering, "Sorry, baby, sorry." She had good reason to be anxious, she thought. Talk of the end was everywhere. Armageddon, apocalypse, by flood, by tsunami, by flaming asteroid, shortage of water and food was inevitable, claimed even the most rational voices on NPR. The only news, at Josh's firm suggestion, Nicole allowed herself. Despite her news purge, she caught the headlines on the stand in front of the convenience store and watched snippets of the primetime news while online at the pizzeria. The ads plastered across the subway walls announced new movies. Apocalypse via plague, zombies, earthquake, fire, and or ice. Novels, some of you had probably written them. set in dystopian landscapes line the shelves of bookstores. Autism rates were skyrocketing, the ozone depleting, and you couldn't eat a tuna sandwich because of the mercury. The world was a mess, and people were terrified. There was no denying it. Despite her outward nonchalance, she had friends who actually called her laid back. After Wyatt was born, when all she had at stake multiplied exponentially, she'd come to see that terrible things, the witches and boogeymen of her childhood nightmares, could and did happen during the day. An airplane, once a benign sight, could slice open the world on a perfect blue morning. A pair of psychopaths could take a high school hostage as the lunch bell rang. You, yes, you, could receive mail coated in white dust. And what about that woman on the west side who was walking her dog, electrocuted when she stepped on a seemingly innocent manhole cover? Measles in Park Slope, mumps in Midwood, and the bees were disappearing. Years ago in college, the dying bees had been the talk at parties while a blunt was passed, discussed with a reverence unique to youth. Now, years later, Nicole couldn't stop worrying about the bees, among other things. So, I'm just going to read one more short section because that was kind of depressing, wasn't it? And now is the time when I tell you that Nicole is based on myself. I can't believe fiction writers are so good at lying about that stuff, right? I compulsively have to tell you. But everyone who knows me knows, except I'm not smoking pot in my bathroom, and sadly, and she is. But yes, I definitely pulled from real life. So there's 7 other perspectives in the novel, and there's 5 women. There's Allie, who's one half of a 2-mom family who's ambivalent about her wife carrying her child. And there's Nicole, the neurotic character. There's a Tibetan nanny named Tenzin. She's the one that all the Goodreads readers like the best because she's nice. And then there is Tiffany, who is the wild card, who grew up working class and has now rewritten her identity so that she fits in with this group of middle class, upper middle class moms. And last but not least, there's Rip, the stay-at-home dad. Now Rip, hold on, I can't even find the section in my own book. Now Rip loves being a dad. And are there any stay-at-home dads in the audience here? Anybody? Nobody. Well, I feel bad because usually when there's a stay-at-home dad in the audience, he comes up after and he's like, yeah, I think about that stuff. So Rip loves his stay-at-home dad life, and he's trying to convince his wife Jen, who is a corporate she's an investment banker. Grace, oh my God, thank you. Can you believe that? Who are you?
My name's April. I was your student.
Oh my gosh,
How you guys?
April, you're the best.
Did she used to be named Jen?
She was. Can you believe that? I'm a little nervous up here all by myself. Usually I do readings with like 3 other writers. So Grace, who clearly I haven't recovered from renaming, she is a investment banker and she does not want to have another child, but Rip is trying to convince her so that he can maintain his stay-at-home dad life. In the last 3+ years, Rip had logged hundreds of hours at playgrounds, play spaces, and play groups, and every play date was a lesson in the new boundaryless definition of gender. He'd be lying if he didn't admit to enjoying the more obvious perks for a hetero guy living the stay-at-home dad life. Mommies smelled nice and served delicious snacks. Never was there a bottle of vino under $13 at the playgroup. Each day held umpteen chances he'd catch a glimpse of cleavage or the curve of a butt cheek winking at him through those tight jean leggings the mommies love to wear. They're called jeggings, I believe. Rip often felt as if you were living a kind of fantasy, the setting for a cliched porn. Like when Tiffany, the hottest mommy, had invited Rip and Hank over so Rip could help her can the blueberries they'd picked upstate. While Billie Holiday had crooned and Hank and Harper built snowmen with homemade Play-Doh, Rip held the mason jars as Tiffany poured the jam that slid almost seductively into each hot glass container. He had watched Tiffany's breasts quiver through the thin cotton tank top, smelled the nectar covering her hands, her slender forearms staining her puffy lips. He'd felt a compulsion to taste her and felt certain in the way she let her tongue slide over her bottom lip, the way she let her long hair tickle his cheek as she bent to screw on the jar tops, that she too wanted him to slip his hand over the breasts he had seen so often. Breasts, breasts, and more breasts. It had been 4 years of nipples, all shades of pink and brown, erect and glistening, fresh from a satiated baby's mouth. Only Lee was so modest as to breastfeed with a swaddle blanket shielding her. He'd known Susanna's breasts, small but perfectly shaped, Nicole's breasts, large with wide purplish nipples, and Tiffany's, his favorite. Full and white, almost translucent, a network of blue-green veins radiating from her petal-pink areolae. It's Latin. Yes. Tiffany had zero qualms about unleashing her breasts for Harper to nurse anywhere and any time. And Rip had seen them enough to memorize them, to think of them as old friends. These weren't women to hide themselves. These were the daughters of the feminist revolution, after all. They'd taken month-long prenatal breastfeeding classes. They'd given up trying to hide a wriggling baby under their $50 Hooter Hider nursing covers. And Rip could see in their eyes and in their relaxed smiles a gratitude toward him for giving them permission to let their breasts roam free. The mommies thought of him as his Mama Rip, diaper changer, boo-boo kisser, nose wiper, playground pal, a sensitive shoulder to cry on when the monotony of motherhood felt like just too much. How little they knew about how grateful he was for their breasts. That's it, guys. I told Steve and Leanne, my friends, that I was going to read a serious section, but I didn't.
Anyone who has questions for Julia Fierro, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
You talked about Nicole, was it being based on yourself? Are there any other characters that you pulled from real life experiences?
Since we're not in Brooklyn, I can be honest. It's interesting because there's a part of me in all the characters, which I think is the way it is. Basically I'll always be writing about my fears and needs, and that sounds like overwhelming when you realize that as a writer, but I think you'll never really make sense of them. So you just have to keep writing. And this book is through the filter of these characters, these 30-something characters, but I'm working on this other book that is also very autobiographical, but a coming-of-age story, and still same issues. But, it's amazing how the characters in the book, like Allie, who's the artist, who's the one half of the two-mom family, she started out very much based on one of my closest friends, who lives very close to me in Brooklyn, and she was totally aware of it. She had read sections of the book. But as the book developed, her character totally morphed. And she took on more characteristics of one of my male friends who's in his 60s, also an artist, who never wanted to have children. So it just happened. And I think that's that's why I write novels, probably instead of short stories, is so that I can lose myself enough that it does often feel as if the book is writing itself, or the characters are revealing themselves. One thing I learned from Frank Conroy, you guys may have heard of, was he used to talk about, I wonder if I've rewritten this, I don't know, but I'll let Frank have the credit here, that writing a novel, and I think maybe he used it more for short stories, but is like fumbling in a dark room looking for the light switch. So there's like so much anxiety and fear where you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? What am I doing? I'm also scared of the dark. And when you find the light switch and put it, and the light goes on, it's like, oh my God, you know, it's like you as the writer can feel that surprising and inevitable feeling. And all of these, most of these characters started out based on real people. Tenzin, the nanny, is like 100% based on my old babysitter, who is a really great friend. She's really excited. She was sad I changed her name. She was like, why did you change my name? I was like, my editor made me do it. But she's really proud of me. She's like, you're furthering the Tibetan cause. And I was like, I guess. But she's just wonderful. And the most fictionalized character in the book is Rip. Nope. I haven't met any stay-at-home dads as wonderful as Rip, despite his breast obsession.
You know, from the beginning of the book, you gave yourself this confined time range. Was that really difficult for you to fit this whole story in 3 days?
Actually, I gave it to myself so that it was an aid. Because because what interests me what's so interesting to me when I'm writing in third person specifically is to get as close to the consciousness of the characters as possible. So the potential side effect with that is you can like hang out in their heads forever. And I was aware of that. Like, it's almost like my blessing and my curse is like, I feel like I'm strong and confident with character psychology. But as writers, we often lean on what we're most comfortable with. So it's good to figure out what you're good at so you can like be aware when you're abusing it, using it too much. But so I gave myself that very strict timeline so that I would stay in line. So it was kind of like giving myself boundaries, and it was really fun to I mean, there's not, well, I don't want to give you any spoilers, but for sections of the book, there's not a ton happening, I mean, except everyone's lying to each other practically, but it was really helpful. And now in my next book, I'm ready to give myself a whole summer. I know, right? Growing up. That was a good question. Thank you. I'm really proud of you. And grateful.
What inspired you to write a book from 7 different perspectives?
Insanity. No, really, what? Oh, wait, I have a good answer to this one. Okay. So, I always liked reading those kinds of books, like Barbara Kingsolver's Poisonwood Bible, Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections. Like, I think the reason that I read and write, and maybe some of you feel this too, I hope, is to feel less alone, because in real life, you can't really know what's going on in somebody's head, even those that you love, and you're like, do they really love me? Do they really like me? And so in a book, you're so, you're sharing consciousness. And I also just think it's so fascinating the way in which every one of us interprets life so completely differently. And that's what, makes us feel so alone. And I believe that true love is really just about finding someone who shares your delusional interpretation of the world. And I've found that person. Thank goodness. But I'm fascinated with that, with the kind of, with the experience it gives the reader, because the reader is able to experience what each character's interpretation is. And then they get to do that sort of fun, subconscious, if I've done my job, compare and contrast of the different characters' perspectives. And also, I watch a lot of television. Sorry, I stole your question. I coached Leanne in case no one asked questions. So, and a lot of my favorite TV series alternate perspectives, like The Sopranos. Come on, great point of view technique. 6 Feet Under, awesome, like hyper real point of view technique where you're like slipped into the character's consciousness and like a musical happens, right? So I really, I was very influenced by all the television I watch because I'm an insomniac and I watch a lot of TV and knit at night. And I learned a lot from watching television, particularly watching like 3 or 4 episodes in a row, which is not healthy. And then you start to see sort of like the careful delivery of information and the order of information and the way in which momentum is gradually increased and the way in which character is gradually revealed and storylines are structured. And so I think everyone should watch a lot of television if you don't already.
So some authors kind of say that characters live with them after they finish the book, and some authors say that their character's a book, and then when the book is over, they're gone. They're not there.
Those are
So
bad
kind of
authors.
So kind of like, where are you on that spectrum?
That's interesting. Definitely when you're writing it, it feels like you're reading a ginormous book that you love, hopefully. Like when I read War and Peace in college, right, which I loved except for all the weird philosophical sections. You can just skip those. Otherwise, it's like a soap opera. And I would have dreams with the characters in it, and it was just amazing. And I feel that way about the TV series, or I listen to all the Game of Thrones books on audio. Highly recommend it. It like changed my perspective because I was so immersed. And when I was writing Cutting Teeth, I just knew them so well. And I had done a lot of work beforehand because when my children were before I had enough money to double the babysitting, I would send myself like on my iPhone, like 1-line emails that were like, Rip's, secret fear, or, Rip's allergic to this, or like a section, like a little moment, or there needs to be a scene in the second, half of the book where Tiffany says this to someone and they react. And so by the time I sat down and dedicated myself to writing the book, I had probably like 20 pages on each character. But I never went back and reread those pages unless sometimes I would take chunks if it was like a scene that, I just started writing. But really it was just to inform myself of the characters. So when I went into the book, I was so confident. It was like I'd known them my whole life. So when I first finished the book, it was devastating to not be with them. Now I'm getting a little sick of them, honestly. And then also, like last night I had someone, I probably shouldn't admit this, no one's going to buy my book now, but whatever. So someone emailed me and they The narrator was clearly me, right? I knew. And the first thing that somebody said, I think it was Milena, who's a great writer, she was like, I just hated this narrator. They were just so unlikable. And I was like, oh my God. Plus, I'm like a, obsessive pleaser in real life. And I really like nice people in real life. Like, I expect a lot from people because I expect a lot from myself. So it's amazing. So fiction is where I go, to be honest, where I can't read fiction if it's not dark and disturbing and there's unlikable characters in it. So, but I was at the Brattleboro Literary Festival this weekend, and this woman raised her hand. I was reading with Miranda Beverly Whittemore, who wrote Bittersweet, and her book is even darker than mine, and we do a lot of readings together. And this woman raised her hand, and she's like, do you have any recommendations for happy books? And we were both like, no. And then, it makes you question but I think that, I just wrote an essay about this for Penn American for their banned book week. And I wrote about In Cold Blood because that book changed me. And I wrote about how I wept for Perry Smith, the protagonist. Even though he's a murderer, he, in many ways wouldn't get sort of the chance to redeem himself in real life that I think Capote gives him in the book. And how for me there's this moment when I want to dismiss a character who has done something despicable, and I can't because the writer has revealed to me a vulnerability or a flaw that I share. And that moment of redemption for me is bigger than the book. And so for me, it really feels like I'm practicing my humanity probably more on the page as a writer and a reader, since I hardly ever leave my apartment. But and growing up in a home where, my father is a fiery Italian immigrant, and both my parents are survivors of poverty and abuse, and it was an unpredictable place. So there was a lot of need to forgive, and so I really learned that through books. I found myself at a pretty young age searching for books where I had to practice that kind of forgiveness and acceptance of unlikable characters. And my parents were like, but so they don't listen to the radio, thank God.
I guess I didn't find your characters unlikable, but it didn't seem like really any of them liked each other. And
That's true.
Whether friends, like the female friendships, or the romantic pairings, any of them seemed to get along very well. Even the kids had a lot of tension.
Yes.
Which I understand why you would write tense relationships more interesting. But which relationship among your characters do you think is your favorite or the most interesting, and why?
I think, actually I was talking to Steve and Leanne a little bit about this at dinner. I definitely think that period in life, which is so brief when you have very young children, I think it's incredibly challenging, and that it's this sort of test, and it puts a lot of pressure on relationships. And I think what I was most interested in, even though they really are so cruel to each other sometimes, is the relationships between the women, and the relationship between Lee and Tiffany. Even though it cracks at a certain point, I think that kind of intense need that, particularly women, in my generation of, a certain privileged class have when they have very young children. I think that, I don't know, I wanted to write about the difference, I wanted to write about a different kind of motherhood. My mother didn't socialize as much when we were little. She was really stuck in the house without any sort of relationships with other mothers. And I think that now there's an expectation for women to be with each other a lot, you know, for children to be like socialized right away, but you know, like when they're like 3 months old, like they're already in a play group. And I feel like women are very incredibly hard on themselves, and that there's still this image of this perfect mother. And so I wanted to show the women's, you know, women looking to each other in what could have been an authentic, you know, a genuine need, but not being able to put aside their insecurities, and sort of judging each other instead of comforting each other. I hope that makes sense. I don't want to give too much away.
Absolutely. So cutting teeth is fiction, but would you ever consider writing like nonfiction, like an autobiography or something?
You guys have the good questions over here. Someone has coached you. Well, I do have this big book that I feel like I need to write, and I'm getting closer to being grown up enough to write it. 'Cause you know, nonfiction, I just feel like my father has an incredible story. He grew up during World War II in Italy with no electricity, no running water, no medicine, no shoes, no underwear, and he really is this embodiment of the American dream. My mother's American. They met in the 60s at a dance, a Catholic dance in the Bronx. She spoke no Italian and he spoke no English. She's Irish American. And her father was an example of a different kind of American dream, growing up working class Irish American, first generation. And post World War II, he just started this engineering company with this engineer. He was pretty much like an uneducated, just charming guy, and just started this business. And they ended up, you know, being really instrumental in building the Twin Towers. So I do have this book that's sort of about the men in my family and their obsession with the American dream, and kind of how it's like tortured them. You know, my grandfather's no longer alive, and also they really didn't like each other, you know, because they had very different ideas of what it meant to be successful. And so I would really like to tell that story, and about how like the women were kind of trapped in between, like dealing with these sort of emotional, you know, obsessive, somewhat charming men's like dreams. And I would love to write about the history of New York during the building of the World Trade Center. So, and the frame that I have in mind is my parents' house was almost destroyed by Hurricane Sandy, and so watching them clean up and helping them clean up after that, like basically we were like just, my father's somewhat of a hoarder because of growing up so poor, and so there were all my grandparents' stuff that he couldn't throw away, and his stuff, and it was almost like a what's it called, those little things that you bury, the time capsules, you know. So I thought that would be an interesting frame. So first I have to write this other novel though, and then maybe I'll be grown up enough. Like I almost feel like I've forgiven, probably, right? Is this what my children are going to say about me someday? But my parents, so that I have that enough distance, and as grandparents, watching them with my children, you know, is incredibly redeeming. I mean, I just feel so much love for them, and I feel like I'm almost ready to write that story. Yeah, we'll see. But I've written a lot of nonfiction that has been published online in the last 5 months. And mostly the topics that covers, this is what you do when you publish a book. You basically bare all of your secrets and publish essays for free online. So that, I wrote a lot about being obsessive compulsive and how that was challenging when I was pregnant and raising children, and probably is what created that view that no one gets along. Because I don't get along. What else? A lot of essays about writing and the writing process and empathy in writing. And also there's an essay on poetsandwriters.com about my comeback as a writer. So, because I didn't write for so many years, and then I returned to writing. And it's also about Sackett Street and how I built Sackett Street.
All right, well, we've got about 3 minutes, so along those lines,
Yeah.
you're obviously very involved with the community of writers, as your experience with the Writers' Workshop here, and you started your own writing group, the Sackett Group. What do you think writers give each other? And just wondered if you could kind of end on a little
Writer
about
note?
that. Yes.
Well, I talked about it a lot today at the, I got to give a talk to the writers of the workshop, which is so cool. And I was a little nervous about that, but not as nervous as I was for this reading. And, I really didn't realize how, when I was in the MFA program, we were very competitive with each other. Even though we grew up, the 2 years that you're in the workshop are so intense, it feels like you grow up 10 years. And so, when I got to New York City, I was waiting for it to be even more competitive. But what I realized is that writers really need each other. You need each other in so many different ways, whether you have published or you haven't. Sometimes you need someone to just read your work and tell you that it's great, right? You're like, tell me it's good, tell me it's good, tell me. And you also need writers to reach readers. Almost all of the readings that I've done in the last, since May, which have been so many, I mean, it's just, I've done with at least 2 or 3 other writers who just released books at the same time, which is why this feels so weird. I'm keep talking. But, and so it's just wonderful to read together. I love listening to other people read before I read. It's so inspiring. It makes me feel like, oh God, we're here, we're sharing this. It's the closest that our consciousness can come to being together, But I do think that it's amazing how generous other writers can be with each other, because it's hard to get published, it's hard to reach readers. Sadly, less people are reading, I've heard, or reading books, right? I think they're probably reading more on an everyday basis, which is awesome. But I don't know. I just think that, the community that I've experienced, particularly in New York, is really, really generous. And also, we write because we have to. It's not a choice, I think. Otherwise, we would choose something else that's a lot easier and more financially lucrative. And so I think that, being able to spend time with other people who have that need to write is really helpful, and also a great privilege. So I feel lucky that the first half of my life I felt, very alone, and so now I feel that I can be myself, my strange, neurotic, writerly self, because I hang out with other writers.
Well, thank you for coming and spending time with us tonight, and for lots of writers here. So, Julia Fierro is